They laughed at the quiet woman before her audition, but when her fingers touched the piano keys, silence fell and hearts were forever changed. The audition hall was buzzing with excitement. It was one of those rare open days where anyone, regardless of background, could walk in and try out their talent in front of top music judges. People were dressed in stylish clothes, carrying polished portfolios, and confidently chatting about which classical piece they were going to perform. Most of them were young, vibrant, and full of energy. Many came from music schools or had years of training. They were used to the stage, to applause, to attention. In the middle of all this noise and brightness, a simple-looking woman entered through the back door. Her name was Margaret Dawson. She was around 55 years old, wearing a faded gray sweater and a long, plain skirt. Her hair was tied back neatly, not in a stylish way, but in a way that said she didn't want it to get in her eyes. She walked slowly, carefully, carrying an old folder in her hand. The folder looked like it had been used for years, corners bent, a little torn from the edges. She had no makeup on, no jewelry, and no air of importance, just quiet steps and calm eyes. As Margaret entered the room, a few heads turned. Some of the other contestants glanced at her, then looked at each other and smiled secretly. One girl whispered to her friend, "Maybe she's someone's grandmother." Another boy chuckled, "She's probably here to clean the piano." They didn't mean to be cruel, but their laughter was full of assumptions. In a room filled with confident youth, Margaret looked out of place. She didn't seem like someone who belonged to a music audition. Didn't look like a performer. Margaret didn't respond to the stares or whispers. She walked to the registration table and quietly gave her name. The young man sitting there looked up and hesitated for a second, and he smiled in a forced way and said, "Ma'am, are you here for the audition?" Margaret nodded slowly. Boy checked her name off the list and handed her a number, 47. She took it and quietly went to the waiting area. She sat alone in the back row, away from the noisy groups. Her hands rested on her folder. Every now and then, she opened it to look at the sheet music inside. Her fingers gently touched the pages, as if they were something precious. Her eyes moved over the notes, not in a hurry, but with a deep familiarity. Some people kept glancing at her and smiling awkwardly, but she didn't look at them. Her world was quiet, focused, and full of something they couldn't see. Meanwhile, people kept going in and out of the audition room. Some played beautifully, some made mistakes, and some just came to try their luck. The judges inside were growing tired. They had heard so many versions of the same pieces. One judge even sighed loudly and said, "Can we get someone who surprises us today?" Back in the waiting area, Margaret waited patiently. Her number hadn't been called yet, but she didn't seem nervous. She just sat there, occasionally closing her eyes, as if listening to music inside her mind. No one knew what she was thinking. No one knew how much she had practiced, or how long she had waited for a chance like this. To the people around her, she was just a quiet, older woman with an old folder. But Margaret's life had not always been quiet. Years ago, she used to be a music teacher. She had played piano since childhood, and her teachers used to say that her fingers had magic. She taught in a small community center, giving lessons to children whose families couldn't afford big music schools. She wasn't famous, but she was loved by her students. Her life was simple, filled with the joy of music and teaching. She never wanted fame, just the chance to share what she loved. Then life changed. Her husband, who had supported her dreams, passed away suddenly. Bills piled up. Music center shut down. And Margaret, with no other income, had to take small cleaning jobs to survive. Music became a memory she kept hidden in her heart. She sold her piano to pay rent. The folder she carried now was the last piece of her old world, but the music never really left her. Late at night, she would sit in silence and play the piano in her mind. She would read sheet music and hum softly to herself. Sometimes she would sneak into old churches or libraries where pianos stood forgotten in the corner, and play for just a few minutes whenever no one was looking. When she heard about the open audition, something stirred inside her. She didn't plan to impress anyone. She just wanted to play, to feel the keys under her fingers again, to see if after all these years the music still lived in her hands. So here she was, sitting in a crowd of strangers, holding on to the last piece of her dream. She knew they were laughing. She knew they didn't expect anything from her. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. She was here for herself, for the part of her that never stopped loving music. The announcer's voice broke through the waiting room. Number 47. Margaret Dawson, please come to the stage. There was a small pause. People looked around. When Margaret slowly stood up, the same girl who had made the grandmother joke whispered, "Oh, she's actually going to play." A few more chuckles followed. Margaret didn't react. She picked up her folder, held it gently to her chest, and walked towards the audition room. Her steps were steady, but you could see a tiny tremble in her hands. Not fear, but the weight of emotions long held inside. As she entered the room, the three judges barely looked up. One of them scribbled something in his notebook without even glancing at her. Another one checked his watch. A staff member moved towards the piano. Wiping the keys quickly as if preparing it for someone more important, Margaret stood near the piano for a moment. She looked at it with quiet affection, like meeting an old friend after a long time. She placed her folder on the music stand and sat down carefully. Her hands hovered over the keys for a few seconds, shaking slightly. The room was still noisy as someone was talking in the back. A chair creaked, a phone buzzed. None of it touched her. Inside her mind, she was already hearing the music. No one knew what was about to happen. To the judges, she was just another name. To the other contestants, she was just someone to laugh at. But inside Margaret's heart, something powerful was waiting, something that would soon make everyone forget they ever doubted her. The moment before the first note hung in the air, like a breath held too long, and then Margaret had just taken her seat in front of the grand piano. The room was large and formal, with wooden floors, bright lights, and three important-looking judges sitting at a long table. Each judge had a notebook and a pen and a tired look. On their face, they had seen so many people, already young, talented, overconfident performers, some good, some not so good. But now, when Margaret quietly placed her music folder on the stand, none of them seemed interested. One judge didn't even bother to raise his head. Another was typing something on his phone. Only the judge in the middle gave her a polite, quick nod without a smile. Behind her, near the door, a few contestants who had already performed stood watching. A tall boy leaned on the wall with his arms crossed and whispered to another, "This is going to be funny." The girl with heavy makeup rolled her eyes and smirked. Even one of the staff members, standing near the side of the room, looked at Margaret like she didn't belong there. Margaret didn't say a word. She didn't look at the judges or the people behind her. She looked only at the keys in front. Of her fingers hovered above them gently, trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from emotion. This moment meant everything to her, though no one else in the room could understand that. To them, she was just an older, simple-looking woman sitting at a piano. To her, this was a return after years of silence. It was the moment where her heart and music would finally speak again. One of the judges, still distracted, sighed and said, "All right, whenever you're ready." The way he said it, like he was already expecting to be bored, made one of the boys behind her chuckle softly. The sound wasn't loud, but Margaret heard it. Still, she didn't react. She closed her eyes for 1 second, took a deep breath, and placed her fingers gently on the keys. She began to play. The first few notes were soft, delicate, almost like a whisper. A few people didn't even notice, but then something changed. The next phrase came with more depth, more feeling. Her fingers moved with a grace and control that didn't match her quiet appearance. The melody started to rise, slowly building, a mood that felt both peaceful and powerful. Suddenly, the judge who had been writing looked up. He didn't expect it. None of them did. The music wasn't flashy, but it was full of emotion, raw emotion. It sounded like a story being told without words. There was pain in it, but also warmth. It felt like a memory or a dream or a prayer, and it was perfect. The boy who had mocked her earlier stopped smiling. His arms slowly dropped to his sides. The girl next to him blinked, then leaned forward slightly, surprised. The staff member, who had been leaning on the wall now, stood up straight, looking at the piano with wide eyes. Margaret didn't look at anyone. She didn't play to impress them. She played like she was alone in a room with only the music in her soul. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm, her eyes sometimes closing, sometimes watching her fingers move across the keys like dancers. Her hands were not young, but they were skilled, elegant, full of life. Every movement showed a lifetime of practice, of love, of loss. The judges didn't take notes anymore. All three of them were now watching her closely. The one who had been on his phone had put it down. The middle judge slowly removed her glasses, as if seeing more clearly without them. There was no sound in the room now, just the music. Each note Margaret played seemed to land directly into the hearts of everyone listening. Even people outside the audition room, walking by, started to peek inside. The sound was beautiful, so beautiful it made them stop. One old man who worked as a janitor put down his broom and stood in the hallway, listening with his mouth slightly open. A young girl who had been crying after her audition now sat quietly on a bench outside, the music wrapping around her like a blanket. Margaret moved into the second half of her piece. Her tempo increased slightly and the emotion shifted. The sadness was still there, but now something else had entered: hope, courage, joy. It was like watching a sunrise after a long night. The notes sparkled, then danced, then calmed again. Like waves on a quiet lake, inside the room, the boy who had once laughed at her now had his head bowed. His face had changed. No more amusement, only respect. The girl who had whispered jokes was no longer smiling. In fact, she seemed unsure of where to look. The staff member, now completely still, was listening like he never had before. One judge whispered to another, "Where has she been all this time?" The other judge didn't reply. He was too caught in the moment. Then Margaret reached the final lines of the piece. Her hands slowed down. Her body became still. The last few notes hung in the air like feathers, floating gently before touching the floor of silence. And then it was over. No one clapped right away. It couldn't. It was like everyone forgot they were supposed to. The room was filled with a silence that came only after something very special, something real had just happened. Margaret looked up slowly. Her eyes were a little wet, but she didn't cry. She just gave a small, respectful nod to the judges, then quietly stood up from the bench. She picked up her folder, holding it with both hands, as if it was something fragile and dear. She didn't wait for praise or reaction. She was ready to leave. But the middle judge finally stood up and said, "Wait." Margaret paused. The judge looked at her for a few seconds, then spoke softly that ... was extraordinary. The other two judges nodded slowly. One of them said, "I don't even have the words." Behind her, the group of contestants remained silent. For the first time all day, there were no jokes, no laughter, no arrogant comments, only stillness and stunned respect. Margaret gave a humble smile, bowed gently, and walked out of the room. As she stepped into the hallway, the janitor nodded at her with wide eyes. The young girl who had been crying whispered, "That was beautiful." Margaret simply said, "Thank you," and kept walking. Back inside, the judges sat for a long time before calling the next number. The spell had not yet broken. They were still thinking about what they had just heard. Not just the music, but the meaning behind it, the honesty, the feeling, the complete surprise of it all. That day, no one forgot Margaret Dawson, not the judges, not the contestants, not the staff, not the people who laughed or mocked her. Everyone had expected nothing from her, but she gave them everything. Sometimes the greatest talents don't shout for attention. Sometimes they arrive quietly, play their truth, and leave behind a silence that says more than words ever could. The room had never been so silent. Even though Margaret had already left the audition stage, her music still lived in everyone's ears. It felt like a dream that no one wanted to wake up from. Her last note had floated in the air like a soft breath, and now everything was still. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time had stopped for just a few seconds. Inside the audition hall, the judges remained frozen. The man who had been checking his phone earlier now held it face down on the table. He didn't touch it anymore. The woman in the center, who had removed her glasses during the performance, was now cleaning the corners of her eyes. The third judge, the one who had sighed when Margaret entered, was now staring at the piano as if he had just seen it for the first time. Outside the room, people who had been waiting their turn were no longer focused on themselves. They were whispering to each other, asking, "Who was she? Where did she come from? Da 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 da." Some of them didn't even know her name because they hadn't paid attention when it was announced. But now, they were desperate to know more. The same people who laughed at her earlier now stood in silence, too ashamed to speak. They had seen something they couldn't explain. A moment of truth. A miracle. One boy, who had been the most vocal critic before her performance, sat on a bench with his head in his hands. He wasn't crying, but his face was red with embarrassment. His friend asked him quietly, "Why do you think she never performed before? That kind of talent? It's rare." The boy shook his head, still not speaking. Meanwhile, in a small hallway behind the stage, Margaret stood near a vending machine. She held her folder tightly in her arms, still breathing slowly. She didn't look proud or excited. She looked peaceful, as if something inside her had been set free. For years, she had lived quietly, cleaning homes, walking past music stores with a heavy heart, avoiding old students who might ask why she stopped teaching. Now, for just those few minutes, she had returned to the world she once belonged to, the world of music, of feeling, of connection. A staff member approached her gently. He was the same one who had once assumed she was lost when she walked in. "Excuse me," he said softly. "That was ... incredible. The judges want to see you again after the auditions are over." Margaret gave a small smile and nodded. "Thank you," she said. He stood there a moment longer, unsure what else to say. Then he added, "I think you reminded all of us why music matters." Margaret's smile grew a little warmer. "It always mattered," she replied quietly. "I just forgot how much I needed it." Back in the audition room, one of the judges had picked up her folder. She had left it by mistake, flipped through it carefully, almost reverently. The pages were old but clean. Handwritten notes were in the margins. Some sheets had faded pencil marks, probably decades old. One of the judges said, "These aren't just notes. These are memories." The woman nodded. "There's pain in these markings, and love, and life." The other contestants began to speak more now, but the tone had completely changed.
No one.
Was bragging anymore? No one was talking about which famous composer they would play or how many years they had trained. Instead, they were asking real questions. How long has she been playing? Why hasn't anyone heard of her? Do you think she taught herself? Then someone found her name on the audition list. Margaret Dawson, a girl read aloud. The room went quiet again, just for a second. That name was now unforgettable. It had become more than just a name. It was a moment of truth, a lesson. It's a story. The young girl who had made fun of Margaret's clothes earlier now felt embarrassed. About herself, she walked away from the group, sat near the window, and looked outside. For the first time, she started to wonder if she had been focusing on the wrong things, her looks, her clothes, the attention. Remembered Margaret's hands on the piano, moving so gently, so confidently, without needing applause. And she realized that was what real strength looked like, in a quiet corner of the building. Margaret sat on a bench with a cup of tea from the machine. A young boy, maybe around 16, approached her nervously. "Excuse me," he said, clutching a folder of his own. "I just wanted to say you were amazing. I've never heard anything like that before." Margaret looked up at him and smiled. "Thank you, young man. Are you a teacher?" he asked, still unsure how to speak. "I used to be," she replied, looking down at her tea. "A long time ago? Why did you stop?" he asked. She took a deep breath, then said, "Life happened. I lost people I loved. I had to take care of things. Music had to wait." The boy didn't know what to say, but Margaret noticed the tears building in his eyes. "You play?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Yes, but I get nervous. I forget the notes. I don't think I'm good enough." Margaret placed her cup down and said, The notes are important, but the heart matters more. You can learn to play fast, but feeling takes time. Don't rush it. Don't play for others. Play because it's who you are." The boy smiled through his tears and said, "That's exactly what you did, isn't it?" Margaret nodded. Meanwhile, word had started to spread. Someone had secretly recorded a short clip of her performance and posted it online. Within minutes, the video was being shared. People were commenting things like, "Who is this woman?" I cried, just listening to that. Why hasn't she been discovered already? By the time the auditions ended that day, Margaret had become the most talked about performer, not just because she played well, but because she reminded people of something they had forgotten. In a world full of competition, pride, and pressure, she showed what real music is made of: soul, truth, love, and history. That evening, the judges met privately. They had been part of many auditions, heard hundreds of talented people, but something about Margaret had touched them deeply. One judge said, "She wasn't just playing notes, she was sharing her life. That's rare." Another added, "We need to give her more than a callback. We need to give her a platform." But Margaret didn't know about any of that yet. She was already on her way home, walking quietly through the streets with her folder close to her chest. The city lights reflected in her eyes, but her thoughts were still with the piano. Oh, she didn't need fame or trophies. She had already won something greater: her confidence, her joy, her lost self. As she reached the small apartment where she lived, she looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't to anyone specific. Maybe it was to life, or to music itself, or to her late husband who once told her, "Your fingers were made for miracles." That night, she slept better than she had in years. The next morning, Margaret woke up early, just as she always did. The sunlight gently entered through the curtains, and the city outside was beginning to come alive. She stood by her small window with a warm cup of tea in her hand, thinking about the day before. Everything had happened so quickly, yet it felt calm and quiet inside her heart. She wasn't thinking about winning or being famous. She was only feeling grateful that after so many years she had finally played again in front of people. That was enough for her. She watered her plants, folded her laundry, and began to clean her little apartment. Just like every other day. But even though her hands were doing everyday chores, her mind kept returning to that grand piano, to the shining black keys under her fingers, to the feeling of music flowing out of her soul like a river finally breaking free after being held behind a dam for too long. Then something unexpected happened. Her phone rang. Margaret didn't get many calls. Most of her friends from the past had drifted away. Her son lived in another city and called only once in a while. But this time, it was an unknown number. She hesitated for a second, then answered. "Hello, is this Margaret Dawson?" A warm and polite voice asked. "Yes, this is she," Margaret replied softly. "Hi, my name is Emma. I'm calling from the audition panel you visited yesterday. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She had not expected any follow-up. "Oh no, not at all." Well, Emma continued, "We just wanted to let you know that the judges were deeply moved by your performance. I've never seen them so speechless before. They want to invite you to the final round of the competition, which will be held on stage in front of a live audience." Margaret held the phone close, silent for a second. A part of her was thrilled. Another part was nervous. "Very kind of them," she said gently. "But are you sure?" Emma laughed softly. "Margaret, we're not just sure. We're honored. In fact, we've been receiving messages from all over ever since someone uploaded a clip of your performance online. People are asking about you, praising you, even crying over your music. You've touched hearts, Margaret." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She didn't know what to say. "I didn't know. I didn't think anyone would care." Emma replied, "They do, and so do we. Please say you'll come." Margaret smiled and whispered, "Yes, I will." That same afternoon, when she stepped out to buy groceries, something strange happened. At the small corner shop she always visited, the man behind the counter looked at her for a moment longer than usual. Then he said, "Excuse me, Are you the lady who played the piano yesterday? Margaret was surprised. Yes. How did you? No. He pulled out his phone and showed her the video. You're all over the internet. You're amazing. My daughter wants to be just like you. Margaret didn't know how to respond. Her cheeks turned pink. Thank you, she said softly, her voice full of shyness as she walked back home. A woman in the building lobby smiled and said, We're so proud of you, Miss Dawson. Children waved at her. A stranger in the elevator said, That performance gave me goosebumps. Suddenly, Margaret wasn't invisible anymore. The news kept spreading. Local newspapers began writing articles about the silent star. They called her. TV channels showed the clip of her playing. Comments poured in. People from all over the world were saying things like, She made me believe in dreams again, and she reminded me of my mother, and she plays like she's telling a story straight from her heart. Back in the audition headquarters, the judges were still discussing her. One of them, Mr. Rowland, said, She didn't just play music, she gave us something real. That kind of power doesn't come from practice alone, it comes from life. And they weren't the only ones talking. A music professor from a well-known university saw the video and reached out, offering Margaret a chance to give a guest talk to his students. A producer called the organizers of the competition, asking if he could meet her. An old student who had taken lessons from her many years ago posted, That's Miss Dawson. She taught me when I was 10. I can't believe the world is finally seeing her. Margaret tried to stay calm through all this. She was happy, but not overwhelmed. Took everything one step at a time. She still walked to the park every evening, still bought bread from the same bakery, still smiled at her neighbors like always. But inside her, something had changed. She felt alive again. Not just because people were watching, but because she had returned to the part of herself she had buried for too long. As the date for the final performance approached, she received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten in a soft, flowing script. Dear Miss Dawson, I don't know you, but I feel like I do. I watched your audition video with my mother, who was very sick. We both cried. Your music gave us peace. It made my mother smile for the first time in weeks. Thank you. We'll be watching your final performance. No matter what happens, you've already won in our hearts. With love, Carla and Grace. Margaret held the letter for a long time. She had never thought her playing could do something like that. She had always believed music was important, but now she knew which was healing. It was powerful. It was love. The day of the final arrived. It was held in a large concert hall with rows and rows of velvet-covered seats, a high ceiling, golden lights, and a giant grand piano placed at the center of the stage. People dressed in their best clothes filled the room. Some had come just to see her. There were cameras, or reporters, or judges, of course, but now they looked at her with warm, excited eyes. Backstage, the other finalists were busy practicing. Some were stretching their fingers, some were drinking water nervously. Others were talking about how they had followed Margaret's story online. She walked quietly past them, wearing a simple dress, her gray hair tied in a neat bun, carrying her same old folder. One young girl stopped her and said, Miss Dawson, I just want you to know, you've inspired me. Margaret smiled. Thank you, sweetheart. Just remember, music comes from here. She tapped her chest lightly. Don't forget that. Her turn came. A stage manager led her to the side entrance. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience clapped gently, but not because she was famous. They clapped with respect, with admiration. They had already heard her soul once, and they were ready to listen again. Margaret sat down on the piano bench. The lights above warmed her shoulders. The judges nodded at her kindly. A deep, respectful silence fell over the room. She looked at the keys and placed her fingers on them. She took a breath, then she began. Margaret sat on the grand stage, her fingers resting softly on the piano keys. The bright lights above her made everything else fade into the background. The large audience waited quietly, their eyes fixed on the simple woman who had captured the world's attention without trying to. There was no fear in her eyes now, only peace. She didn't come here to prove anything. She came to share something honest, something real. Her music, her heart. She took a deep breath. For a moment, everything went silent. Then she began to play. The first note floated into the hall like a feather falling from the sky. Gentle, light, but full of emotion. It was a melody no one had ever heard before. She wasn't playing a famous classical piece this time. She was playing something of her own, a tune she had once written in her small kitchen years ago, but never shared. A song she had composed when her husband was sick. A melody that spoke of love, loss, hope, and healing. As her fingers moved over the keys, the room was filled with something powerful and soft at the same time. It was as if every note carried a memory. Every pause held a breath from the past. The audience didn't move. No one coughed or whispered. Some people leaned forward in their seats, drawn closer by the invisible pull of her music. Margaret's hands moved with grace. Her eyes stayed mostly closed, not out of fear, but out of feeling. She wasn't performing. The piano spoke for her. It told stories she had never said out loud about her childhood. The piano her parents saved up to buy, the first song she ever learned. About falling in love with a man who always listened carefully when she played. About teaching students, who were more than just children to her. And about the long years when she stopped playing altogether because life became too heavy. It's too painful. The song rose slowly, like the sun coming out after days of rain. It grew stronger, more emotional, like a voice finally breaking through silence. Then slowly, it softened again. Her fingers played with a light touch, like a mother calming her baby, like a prayer whispered into the wind. And finally, the music faded, gentle, soft, like the last page of a story turning by itself. When the last note fell into the air, it was like time froze. Margaret stayed still, her hands still above the keys. She didn't look at the audience right away. She simply sat there, breathing, letting the silence speak. And in that silence, something beautiful happened. Someone in the crowd stood up, then another and another. One by one, people rose to their feet, clapping slowly, then louder. No one shouted or whistled. It wasn't the wild kind of cheering people gave at concerts. This was different. This was deep, respectful, full of emotion. Some people wiped their eyes. Others smiled through tears. The judges stood too. One of them, the same man who had sighed when she walked in at the first audition, had tears in his eyes now. The woman in the middle, who had once looked at Margaret with confusion, was now clapping with her hands over her heart. The third judge, who had once been distracted, looked at Margaret like she was the most important person in the room. Margaret stood up slowly and bowed her head. The applause continued for a long time. She didn't wave or act proud. She simply smiled and walked off the stage with quiet dignity. Backstage, staff members and other contestants greeted her like she was a queen. One young girl hugged her. "You were amazing," she said. "I've never felt something like that from a piano before." Margaret touched her cheek gently. "Music is not just sound," she said. "It's feeling. It's truth." Later, that evening, when the final results were announced, everyone waited nervously. There were many talented players, each one deserving in their own way. But when the host called Margaret Dawson's name as the winner, the entire room exploded in applause again. She walked onto the stage, holding her folder in her hand as always. When they gave her the award, she didn't cry or shake. She just smiled and said, "Thank you for listening. That's all I ever wanted." The video of her final performance went viral. News channels around the world talked about her. The woman who reminded the world why music matters. Magazines wrote about her. A famous pianist said in an interview, "She reminded us that greatness doesn't need fame. It needs honesty." But even with all the attention, Margaret remained the same. She returned to her small apartment, watered her plants, cleaned her home, and still walked to the park each evening. But now, people stopped her on the street. Children asked for her autograph. Young musicians sent her letters saying she gave them hope one day. She received an invitation from a famous music school. They asked her to come and speak to students, to tell them her story, and maybe even teach again. Margaret thought about it for a while, and then agreed. Standing in front of a classroom of young faces, she began to talk. Winning or going viral. She talked about silence, about loss, about how music left her and how it came back. And most of all, she told them not to wait for the world to notice them. Don't play to be heard, she said. Play because it's part of who you are. If life gets heavy, if you lose your way, don't worry. Music will wait for you. The students clapped, but more than that, they listened. Really listened. One evening, Margaret visited her husband's grave. She placed fresh flowers there and sat on the bench nearby. She didn't say much. She just whispered, "I did it." I finally played again. The wind blew softly around her, and she felt a warmth in her heart, as if he was there, smiling beside her. In the following months, she played at small concerts, not for fame, but for joy. In hospitals, at schools, in churches, even at train stations sometimes. Wherever she went, people listened. Not because she was a winner, but because she played from her soul. And one day, a little girl sat beside her on a park bench and said, "I want to play like you when I grow up." Margaret looked at her, smiled, and said, "Then start now. Never stop. No matter what life throws at you." Margaret's story became more than a tale of talent. It became a lesson to the world that simplicity can be powerful, that quiet. People have the loudest hearts, and that it's never too late to begin again. She didn't need fancy clothes or big words. She didn't need a perfect past or perfect plans. All she needed was a piano and the courage to press the first key, and when she did, the whole world listened.